Good evening. I am Amy Lizer, the Executive Director of the Monroe County Historical Association, and I am delighted that you have joined us for tonight's third Thursday lecture series. On your screen, you will find a menu bar and the controls to submit questions via the Q&A function. Now, we ask that you use this Q&A function to post all of your questions for tonight's speaker. Posting the questions help us keep track of them during the presentation. Now, questions can be asked anytime throughout the program, but they will be answered following the presentation. I am very happy to introduce tonight's speaker. Archaeologist Jessica Reitz will discuss the importance of ancient Egypt and the culture it created. Using major archaeological finds, Jessica will examine some of the issues modern archaeologists have with the practices of past scientists. Now, Jessica received her undergraduate degree in history from East Stroudsburg University and her master's in public anthropology with a concentration in historic archaeology from American University. Now, some of you may recognize Jessica. In the early 2000s, she was the administrative assistant at the Monroe County Historical Association. And while she worked for us, she actually took a month leave to participate in a field school archaeological dig at Thomas Jefferson's vacation home and private retreat, Poplar Forest. Jessica recently served as the curator of the Heritage Center of the Western Pocono Community Library before moving to Pittsburgh, where she is now the division manager for the Museum Experience Department at the Carnegie Science Center. In her spare time, Jess spends time with her nieces, her two nieces, baking and training to be an Olympic lifter. Ladies and gentlemen, I am very pleased to welcome Jessica, who will give us her presentation, Ancient Egypt Through the Eyes of a Modern Archaeologist. Welcome, Jessica. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Hi, Amy. Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
We certainly, we appreciate you volunteering your time and being a part of this really great series that we have.
Absolutely. It's an honor to be there. I mean, it's been a while since I've been able to come down to the Monroe County Historical Association and spend some time there. So I get to do this from a distance now.
That's true. That's true. See, there are some silver linings to all of this mess, right?
Absolutely.
Go ahead and share your screen. You can go ahead and start your presentation.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and there we go. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for having me tonight. Thank you for joining this this talk. I am actually really excited to talk to you guys about this. One of my passions is archaeology, and the other passion is ancient Egypt. So for me, it's fun to kind of mix the two when I get a chance to. So tonight we're going to do a little bit of talking about ancient Egypt, the culture, the things that are important to the ancient Egyptians, as well as we'll look at some of the excavations that have been done. We're going to look at British colonization, and just some fun major facts that have been happening recently. So I would like to show you guys this fun little meme I have here. And I found this recently while I was looking for pictures for this presentation, and it's exactly right. Archaeologists back in the day, they would dig these gigantic holes, and nowadays we go a meter down and we document everything. We have documents, and it's really amusing to me to watch some of this stuff. So let's get started. And if I can get this to go to the next slide. Okay, so I wanted to tell you guys a little bit about what archaeology actually is. I get this a lot where people think that I dig up dinosaurs, and I don't. Archaeology is not dinosaurs, that's paleontology, and it's in the geology subfield. Archaeology is actually the study of human history, and we do that through excavation of sites and analysis of the artifacts that we find. It is a subfield of anthropology, which is obviously the study of humans, humanity, culture. One major thing that I get a lot of, and I've actually been attacked by some people, archaeologists are not treasure hunters or grave robbers. We are basically there to do science. And that's one thing that I love about my job at the Science Center, is that I can actually talk about archaeology and science together. And so when you see some of these movies that show us that we're looking for money, for treasure and gold, and that's not exactly what we're doing. We're there to study. You're going to hear this word thrown around a little bit tonight, Egyptology, and actually I tell everybody when I grow up, I'd actually love to be an Egyptologist. But Egyptology is actually a subfield of archaeology. And basically what it is, it's the study of ancient Egyptian history, language, literature, religion, architecture, art, culture, all of it. And it's basically from the 5th millennium BC until the end of its practices in the 4th century AD. It's a little different from American and historic archaeology that you would see today because of all the architecture in ancient Egypt. And in America, we dig holes, we dig units. In ancient Egypt, you're actually excavating mostly monuments, buildings. We'll talk about the Great Pyramids later. That's actually an excavation, even though they're not digging into the ground, they're just walking through a pyramid. So we'll talk a little bit, jumping into ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt is actually broken up in 2 periods. It begins in 5000 BC. You'll see BC a lot before Christ. This is when ancient Egypt happens. Ancient Egypt goes up until about 332 BC with the death of Cleopatra. And actually, speaking of Cleopatra, if you guys see a cat walking through, I will introduce her now. She will probably come over at some point. She is my cat, Cleopatra, speaking of that. But it goes till 332 BC with the death of Cleopatra and the takeover of the Roman Empire. It's when Mark Antony comes in and he dies as well. Sorry, my brain went a little crazy there. But you'll see, so it's broken down into different periods. The Old Kingdom is important because that's when the Great Pyramids were built. A lot of pyramids were built in that time frame, not just the Giza Plateau. And then in the late period to Alexander's conquest is also called the Ptolemaic. So some people know it as the Ptolemaic time period. That's when the Greek influence comes in with Cleopatra and her family and the Ptolemies rule in Egypt at that point. Fun fact is that Cleopatra is actually not ancient Egyptian. She is actually Greek. So that's a fact that most people don't know about her. So here's a map, 2 different maps of Egypt. For most people that don't know, the Nile River actually flows up through Lower Egypt. That's why Lower Egypt is actually at the top of your screen. You guys can see up here, Lower Egypt, actually Nile flows north into the Mediterranean Sea. And Upper Egypt is here, and then Kush and everything else down there. Our second map just shows you a little fun placement of our different locations of monoliths, of pyramids, of statues, of buildings. Abu Simbel, you can see down at the bottom, is actually part of in the Nubian desert. Abu Simbel was created by Ramses the Great for his wife Nefertari. They're actually 2 of my favorites. So I know a little bit more about Abu Simbel than most places, but that actually had a facelift a couple of years ago, not a couple of years ago, multiple years ago. And they actually had to move that because of the inundation of the Nile. They actually had to move it up to a higher cliff because it was actually being covered by water, which is a really fun story. Okay, so when we talk about ancient Egypt, you have to talk about religion. Religion is most of why ancient Egypt is so important. Their religion is so complex. It explains everything that happens in ancient Egyptian life, and every day it just explains everything. As you can see, it lasted for over 3,000 years, and it was polytheistic, which means that they did not worship one god, they worshiped many gods. And I'll have a slide later that'll show you some of those many gods, but there was a god for everything. There was a god for death, there was a god for fertility, for the inundation, for everything. So one of the things about their religion is that their gods were believed to reside within the control the forces of nature. So like I said, the inundation was one of them. there were many different things for the crops growing, so different things. They believed in divine kingship. So this idea is that the pharaoh was a god, which is why you see the monuments built. They were trying to put themselves on the same level as the gods. The pharaoh was represented by Horus, who was the son of Isis and Osiris, who were the two main gods. And he was a falcon-headed god. And as you can see, the gods had the head of an animal and a human body. I'll show you a picture later of them. So each of them had their own different animal that they were supposed to be. So another main thing is that it encompasses contact with the dead, practices such as divination, oracles, magic. So it explained everything. The religion was the biggest aspect of their culture. You'll see it in mummification, you see it in the rites of the dead. I talk about the Book of the Dead in a little while, and that was basically their magic. So some of you guys, if some of my people are on here, they've heard me talk about this next guy, and his name is Akhenaten. He's actually the father of King Tut, and he believed that the Egyptians were on a path to the wrong religion. So what he tried to do is he tried to bring the country back to polytheism, monotheism. Oh, I messed that one up. And he wanted to worship the one god, Aten. He actually created his own little city where he was, Aten was the main god. He put him all over the stelas, the buildings, everything that was out there. And he actually was killed because of this. The Egyptian religion was so important. They tried to say that the inundation was not happening because of him, that the crops were dying, things were happening, the cattle were dying. So he was actually killed, and his son, King Tut, was actually placed on the throne. And they go back to the polytheism of the predecessors. And as you can see, it explained the inundation and everyday events. So the Book of the Dead is something that is really important. It actually holds all the rites, the rituals for mummification, and also all of the rituals for everything. They had rituals for inundation, they had rituals for fertility, they had rituals for making sure that their building was standing. And it kind of was magic. If you actually ever get a chance to look at it, that's why they talk about the magic of the ancient Egyptian culture. Part of the other thing that is really important about their religion is their mummification practices. Mummification was done on everybody. This wasn't done just on pharaohs. It was done on everybody. The only difference is that if you were a pharaoh, you had a gold sarcophagus, you had all of your gold artifacts coming with you into the afterlife, and you also would have a different lifetime in the underworld. As I say, they're not the first to create mummies. They were actually the second. There was actually a group that created the bundle mummies, which is a whole nother discussion. But they were the first to create a way of mummification. Mummification is basically the embalming of the dead. They removed all the organs from the body, and it preserved the body for the afterlife. When the body went into the afterlife, the soul would re-enter the body, and you would actually live your life just as it was when you were living. So mummification is a really important part of the Egyptian religion. So here are some pictures of the gods of Egypt. As you guys can see, you'll see that there are some pictures down here with Ra, who has the Horus, or that's actually, yes, that's Ra. He has the sun over his head. He was also a falcon. Horus as well. Anubis has the jackal head, different ones like that. So these are just some of the major gods of Egypt. There were lots of them. There were way too many for me to talk about tonight. I could talk about the ancient Egyptian religion for hours, and you still would not know 50% of what happened in the Egyptian religion. But these are just some of the main ones. And as you can see, they each had a different thing that they protected. Anubis was the embalming and the dead. Horus was the sky, and the pharaoh we talked about. So everybody had their own thing that they made sure was happening well. So why was the Egyptian culture so important? I talk about this after the religion because the religion was part of it. But their views on death and the afterlife actually dominate the archaeological record. When I talk to people about archaeology, one of the first things that they talk to me about is ancient Egypt. Everybody knows about ancient Egypt. It was something mysterious and fun and something that not anybody knew anything about. So people loved that. They were also great mathematicians, astronomists, and their architecture was phenomenal. I mean, I can talk to you guys about the Great Pyramids and the building of the Great Pyramids for hours. The techniques that they used were by far way past modern standards, and especially at the time period that they were being built. It also lasted for more than 3,000 years. It's actually one of the longest running cultures, and it did a lot of great things. Also their writing, their hieroglyphics. The Rosetta Stone was probably one of the greatest finds ever in archaeological history. And basically the Rosetta Stone had Demotic, my brain is forgetting what the third one was, Greek and hieroglyphics. And we were able to learn hieroglyphics based on the Rosetta Stone and the other two languages that were on there. Hieroglyphics is a language that nobody to this day knows actually how to write, because nobody living can understand it. We basically know, we have ideas of what it says, but we don't actually know what it really does say. And I have an example of that later on in the presentation. So I wanted to talk about British occupancy, just because British occupancy leads into a lot of why archaeology was so big with ancient Egypt. So basically, Great Britain decided that they were going to come in and take control of Egypt. And this lasts from 1882 to 1956, which, fun fact, my mother just said to me, she never even knew that the British occupancy lasted until when she was born. I actually didn't know that. I thought it was earlier than that. But 1956 is the year, and it ends with the Anglo-Egyptian Agreement of 1954. There were many wars, many battles, things that happened throughout this whole time that allowed Great Britain to stay in charge of Egypt. And it was basically to protect their financial interest in the country. They used ancient Egypt as a travel through in order to get to the Orient and trade. So they made sure that they went in. The leadership was not very good at the time, and they just went in and took control, and they held it for many years. One of the fun things about this time period is that many of the Victorians were enamored with history, and they just absolutely loved ancient Egypt. They loved the occult, they loved ancient Egypt and the culture, they loved the mummification. Again, it was something different. But you see an increase in archaeological fieldwork, tourism, and different types of projects going on at this time. So this is a fun little cartoon that I found because the Victorians loved political cartoons. They also loved ancient Egypt. And this one depicts Britain as a strong soldier and Egypt as the fair maiden. And Great Britain is taking care of the fair maiden. But it's just a fun little clip to see. Oops, hit the wrong button. So why is there so much archaeological attention in ancient Egypt? Like I said before, people are always interested in the unknown and the mysterious. And ancient Egypt was extremely mysterious to people in the 1800s, 1900s, because nobody was doing things the way the Egyptians were. Things were written down, but the Egyptian government kept control of a lot of different things. So they weren't able to see these things. So it was easier for them to go and try to pull things from Egypt. Obviously, there's so much history and artifacts. I can't even tell you guys how much artifacts there still are. For an example, they're still finding sites, they're still finding tombs, they're still finding, I think the golden mummies was one of the most recent. There's also that cache of mummies where they were saying, don't open them because we don't need another plague coming through. There's been so much coming out of Egypt in the last couple of years still. And there's still so much more to find, just because it was 3,000 years. I mean, it's hard to believe that we still are not finding everything. Archaeologists were actually looking to rescue sites and artifacts for future research. That one is a funny one to me, even though it is true, because a lot of this, they were rescuing sites, but they were bringing them back to the people that were paying the money for them to go on these archaeological excavations. So a lot of things were taken out of Egypt. A lot of things were not brought back to Egypt. We see that a lot with repatriation. But the majority of major things have returned or were returned at that time. It also goes back to Napoleon's find of the Rosetta Stone. It just brought out this widespread public interest. And mummies. I will talk about mummies all the time. Mummies was probably the biggest reason for archaeological attention, just because, again, you can learn so much from a mummy, and people don't understand it. It was something new to people like that. The embalming process was fantastic, and the fact that you kept a body in natron for 30 to 60 days, it was something different for everybody. And then they just had fun with it. So I'm going to change up things a little bit from what I was going to do originally here. I want to talk a little bit about some archaeological standards before we start looking at some of the different sites. I mentioned repatriation, and repatriation basically is when you take an artifact from its place of origin and bring it back to a place not of its origin. There has been this big run on people bringing back their artifacts. We see this a lot with the Nazis. When the Nazis went into houses and took things, they also went into Egypt, a lot of it. They went into Egypt, they went into Africa, and they took things. So now the whole thing is, how do we get these items back? The Elgin marbles as well, that was another thing. Somebody went into Greece, took these items and had them someplace other than their home of origin. So there is a big kick, and there has been for the last 10 to 20 years, about getting these items back and placing them where they actually belong. Which is a good thing. I think that the country of origin needs to have these. It's their history, it's their culture. So I actually am really interested to see how many of these different items actually will get returned in the next coming years. So documentation and cataloging is a lot. It's been a while since I've been out in the field, but documentation and cataloging was one of the biggest tasks. Excavating is fun, but taking all these items back to the lab and making sure that you're documenting and cataloging them is a lot of time. And it's fun to see these different items once you bring them out of the field. It's a little different than what they were doing. One of the fortunate things is that Petrie, who is the father of modern archaeology, he created a lot of these standards when he went to Egypt in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And he was actually able to teach modern archaeologists about it. So it was really neat to see the difference in how things were done prior to and once Petrie hits Egypt. So we now have a Ministry of State for Antiquities that controls permits. In Egypt, you cannot go into Egypt without having a permit. You are not allowed to excavate in Egypt without a permit. You are not allowed to take anything out of Egypt without a permit. You basically can't do anything in Egypt unless our Antiquities says yes. Zahi Hawass, who I'm hoping that a lot of you know, he actually was part of this. He's been working very hard to make sure that antiquities stay within the country. And he's done a really great job of excavating and talking to people about the culture. Geophysical methods, which is something fun that I wish that they had years ago. I do have some examples of it in some of the slides of the Great Pyramids. And it's really neat because you can actually see into the pyramids, you can see into a site, you can see into things without even having to excavate. And it's one of the things that we have started using a lot more of, LiDAR, things like that, drones. It's so cool just to see the way that things are going. And one of the other things that I like to tell people is there's no going on expeditions for rich people, which is pretty much what the British archaeologists did. A lot of them had people that were paying for them. Howard Carter, for example, had Lord Caravan. He paid for his whole expedition to Egypt while he was looking for Tut's tomb. He ends up dying for it, but he paid for it. So there was a lot of people like this until the Ministry of State for Antiquities comes through. You see a lot of expeditions, and this is where grave robbing and treasure hunting comes from. So you get a lot of that, and modern archaeologists are dealing with that now. So here's a list of some of the major archaeological finds within the last 200 years. Actually, the Valley of the Golden Mummies is actually one of the most recent, but there were different things that people were finding. Khufu's ship is one of them. This was found on the plains in the Giza Plateau. Obviously, the Great Pyramid, that was one of the most important archaeological finds for them. King Tut, obviously, I'm sure that there's not a single person on this webinar that doesn't know of King Tut and the treasures that came out of the tomb. And then the Greater Temple of Abu Simbel is one of my favorites, as I said. Seeing UNESCO, which is the World Heritage people that come in and they do preservation and work on the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and they have the money to come in and take care of all of these different sites, but they were part of that, which is really great. So I picked a couple of them just to talk to you guys about tonight, and I will head through these. So the Great Sphinx, which is in the Giza Plateau, is a very important find for a couple of reasons. The reasons for it are that his face, so a sphinx is actually the head of a human on the body of a lion. And sphinxes were not big in Egyptian culture before this. And this actually comes out of different cultures and it becomes something major. There's actually an avenue of sphinxes going up to Luxor and Karnak. But this one is one of the earliest, which is really neat. As you can see on the side here, we have just what the complex, this is actually the Sphinx and surrounding monuments for Khafre's pyramid. And then the other 2 pictures on the top, you can see that is the Sphinx from the chest up. It actually was completely covered at one point from the chest down. And then the bottom picture is actually what it looks like today. It actually has been moved around and taken care of, and you can actually see his paws and how big his paws are, which is really neat. So a little bit of the history. It is one of the world's largest monuments. It's huge, and it spans a good couple of meters. It is believed to be from 2603 to 2578 BC, and they believe that it was for the pharaoh Khafre. Now, there were 3 different owners for the Great Pyramids. Khafre was the middle largest, and then Khufu, who we'll talk about in a few minutes, that was the largest of them. Khufu was actually the father of Khafre, and he is thought to have, there's many different theories behind who the Sphinx was erected for, but Khafre is the main reason. The face on the Sphinx actually matches one of the monuments to Khafre, so they believe that it was him, and it's also the closest to his pyramid. As I said, it is included in the complex of structures that surround his pyramid. And one of the biggest things that people ask me a lot is didn't Napoleon's men actually shoot their nose off? No, they did not. Actually, it was done many years prior to that. They believe in a resurgence of people coming in to say, we need to be monotheistic instead of polytheistic. So there was a lot of things that were done in the name of religion when it comes to that. So some of the archaeology, Caviglia is the person who at first came and uncovered him. Again, he came on multiple expeditions for sponsors, but in 1816 he cleared the feet of the Sphinx, and he finds the stela of King Tutmos IV. There's a story about King Tutmos IV having a dream where the Sphinx comes to him and says that if you erect this stela in front of me, I will make you pharaoh, and then he becomes pharaoh later on. So there's a fun little story about that, and the stela in front of it actually depicts that story. After he did that, he then recovered the feet due to concerns over preservation. This is something we'll talk about in the next slide, but you typically don't do something like that. But then again, it was cleared in the 1930s by Emile Barras. So based on modern standards, it is very unheard of that you cover up a monument after you uncover it due to preservation purposes. As modern archaeologists, we do recover our sites when we are done with them, but usually we're digging up a field or we're digging up a place around a house. You don't really cover up buildings or monuments or anything else that you find. You leave those out. And then there have been a lot of preservation efforts that have been done on the Sphinx. Unfortunately, where it sits, it gets hit a lot by sandstorms, by the wind. So the limestone that it's actually made of is actually deteriorating. There's also some water nearby, and it's actually started to leak into the surrounding areas of the Sphinx, and it leaches up into the limestone and it breaks it down. So they just recently had to put some pumps in there to keep that water out of the area. Which is kind of neat. I'm glad to see that they're working on some preservations for that. Okay, so another site I wanted to talk about, as I said, is the Great Pyramid. So the Great Pyramid is actually the one in the back that has that capstone that's still on it. So you can actually see in the front here is the actual Giza Plateau. We have the step pyramids as well there. The 3 pyramids out front were for wives of the pharaohs. And there's a bunch of little ones around the surrounding area as well. The picture underneath is what it looks like today with that small little capstone up top. You can see the interior of the tombs inside the pyramid, and then the bottom picture is actually what the pyramid would have looked like in Khufu's time. It would have actually had a limestone covering completely around it. They believe that actually fell off or was taken by people to use it in other different monuments and such. So some of the history, it is the oldest and largest of the pyramids in Giza, as I said, and it is the oldest of the 7 wonders of the world, and the most intact of all of those. Besides the limestone covering, it's completely intact. And it was built for Pharaoh Khufu in 26 BC. He actually died before it was finished, and it was built by about 2,000 laborers, which were not slaves. They were actually builders and stuff from within Khufu's people. So some of the archaeology of it. So as I said, Petrie went to Egypt at the age of 26. I said he was the father of modern archaeology, and the Great Pyramid was one of his first finds. He began excavations in 1880 on the pyramid, and he worked at a much higher number of sites in which with much greater speed than an archaeologist would today. He was doing 3-month excavations on this, then onto something else. And he was really well known for creating a lot of the standards that we have today. People have expanded on them, but for the most part, he was the father of archaeology. And he saw his life as a mission of rescue archaeology. He was trying to get as much information as he possibly could before the civilization went away. So some of the modern standards, one of the things that really gets me is that they would use dynamite to get into some of the antechambers within the pyramid. So there are holes blown into the pyramid, and things were destroyed that they were not able to get a hold of. But one of the things that I really liked about him was that he was the first to actually map out the areas he was able to find. He took very detailed notes. He actually is one of the people that teaches Carter how to excavate later on. So he did a really good job with a lot of the different things. I actually own a couple of his archaeology books that he created, and we still use some of his stuff to this day. So King Tut's tomb, this again is one of the most famous of all, out of every archaeological site throughout the world. I doubt that there's many people that don't know something about King Tut. And you can see here, we've got Howard Carter in the top corner, when he opened up the most inner sarcophagus. The bottom is what King Tut's tomb actually looked like. You can actually see the different rooms and where his antechamber was, and you can actually get an idea of like all the different artifacts that were in there. The picture with the rope is the front door, is the door to the tomb. It was actually, that's how they found it. It was pretty neat. And then the underneath is just some of the artifacts that came out of the tomb. So a little bit of history on King Tut. He was a boy king who died at 19. Like I said before, Akhenaten was his father. He was killed, and he took power as soon as Akhenaten was removed from power. He brings back the polytheism, and he rules from 1342 to 1325, which is not a very long time period. Like I said, he reversed his ruling. But one of the things about King Tut is that he had a crippling bone disease. He had a lot of problems, medical problems, things like that, because of all the inbreeding. Most of the time, pharaohs married within their family. So you married your sister or you married your cousin. So a lot of people were inbred. And because of that, they believe that that is what led to his early death. And then they also believe that his death was sudden. They don't think that it lasted for a long time, that it was very sudden, because they believe that there should have been more chambers built within. They shoved 5,000 artifacts into his tomb. Things were piled up to the ceiling. Things were everywhere. They were just thrown places. It was actually very, very packed within his tomb. So the archaeology of the tomb is well known because it was the most intact tomb ever. Nobody had entered this tomb prior to Howard Carter entering it. It was closed for 3,200 years, which means a lot. It actually is in the Valley of the Kings behind a number of different tombs. So nobody actually knew it was there until Howard Carter found it in 1922. And it took him and his team a decade to remove and catalog the 5,000 artifacts within the tomb. So it took a really long time. Nowadays, it wouldn't take that long in order to catalog something. So based on modern standards, I really don't have anything bad to say about Howard Carter, only because he was taught by Petrie. He did a really good job. He joined the British-sponsored Archaeological Survey at the age of 17, learned from a young age, and he was praised for his improvements in the protection of and the accessibility to existing excavation sites. And he deployed this grid block system, which we use today. So it's really cool that that he was able to do all of this. The only thing that I have against him is that he punched a hole in the door of the tomb. Normally we don't like to do things like that because it destroys the historical significance of everything. But at least they have pictures of it before he destroyed it. So this is just a little fun for all of you guys. You can't talk about King Tut without talking about the curse. Everybody knows about the Curse of King Tut. And this was not a mummy is going to come get you. This was that multiple people died after the opening of the tomb. There were some workers that died of a lung disease. One of the reasons for that is because you have an enclosed tomb like that for so long, you create mold and bacteria and stuff. So when you open that tomb up, you have to let it air out before you can actually walk into that space. And a lot of people walked into it prior to them actually airing it out. So a lot of people got sick for that reason. Lord Carnarvon, who was the person that put all the money into Howard Carter going on this excavation, actually dies a year later. And this is why they think that, or they claim the curse happened. But he was actually very sick, and he had a mosquito carried disease. They don't know exactly what it was. But the curse comes from a journalist. It actually was not from anybody else, but they were trying to create a story so that people would stay away from the tomb, so that Carter could actually do what he had to do. So that's where the curse comes from. So that is all the sites I want to talk about, but I also want to talk about mummies because, like I said, mummies are important to ancient Egypt. It's actually one of the things that I know the most about. I actually just finished up with a Mummies of the World exhibit at the Carnegie Science Center, so I know a lot about this, and I trained most of the people who worked with me. So you can see some different mummies. I have up top what an unwrapped mummy looks like, what a wrapped mummy looks like. There's also animal mummies. And then this one's just an example of the most recent find of Nefertiti, them believing that this is actually her and the reconstruction that they did of her. So just a couple of things about them. As you saw, they would unwrap them to study them, which actually destroys them. The wrapping is held on there with, oh my gosh, and the word just went right out of my head, with basically glue. Resin. They used resin to attach the wrappings to the mummies. So what happens when you pull off this resin that has been hardened over thousands of years? It pulls off skin and it destroys the actual mummy. They were also taken to Britain and used in Victorian unwrapping parties. They would actually sit there and unwrap a mummy. They put it in their middle of their dining table and they would unwrap a mummy. You'd get a treasure if you found a ring or a jewelry or something. That was your take home. If not, at the end of the day, you got a foot or a hand or a head, depending on what it was. That was your take home for the day. And they were also used as fuel for trains. They were sent over to America and they were put in the back of trains, and that's what they burned the train or moved the train on. And they were also ground down and thought to be a cure-all. So you actually drank a mummy. Cannibalism does not sit well with a lot of people. So modern studies, and why I talk about mummies so much is that nowadays we use CT scans and x-rays to study mummies. So instead of unwrapping them, we can look at them through technology. They've done some really cool things with CT scans and x-rays. Actually have an example coming up for you guys of a recent find that is really fun. But CT scans are the best way to look at a mummy. You can figure out how they died. You can figure out what they looked like. There's so much science behind CT scans and mummies. I could talk about that for hours as well. They are also now housed in museums or placed back in their tombs. So a lot of the mummies were sent back to Egypt, and they do have them in the Cairo Museum. They have them in different places. But for example, King Tut is actually, whenever any of his items travel, he does not leave. He is actually back in KV 65, which is the term for his tomb. He is actually still in the tomb. They placed him back there a couple of years ago, and he's been there since. And like I said, there's so much to learn from a mummy. We can learn disease, we can learn how to fix bones, pre-mortem, post-mortem. we can learn about tooth decay and dental stuff. There's just so much to learn. So this is the fun that I was talking about. I don't know if any of you guys have seen this in the news, but recently, actually within the last 2 weeks, I believe, they actually found a pregnant mummy. And this is pretty neat. If you look at the sarcophagus, it looks pretty normal, pretty plain. And they actually believe this to be a priest. So that's why this is so cool and such a different thing. And why I talk about hieroglyphics and that we do not fully understand hieroglyphics, because they believe the priest's name was actually on the sarcophagus. When they opened it up and started to do CT scans, they actually found a tiny foot in her abdomen. And there was also female features. So if you guys look down at the bottom, there's a mass down in her abdomen. That is actually the fetus. So it's just a recent find. It's the first of anything. It's the first time they've ever found a fetus. And it's neat to me because all the organs were always removed. So why was the fetus left in there when they embalmed her? But it's sad, but it's also really interesting, and it's science. So like I said, it was believed to be a priest. The hieroglyphics translation found the name of the priest. It's the first of its kind anywhere in the world. And it's part of the Warsaw Mummy Project. So there are a whole bunch of mummies in Poland, but they're actively doing research on them, doing science. Let's see. And the fetus was about 26 to 30 weeks, which was pretty far along. So it was pretty neat to see that. Okay, and that ends my presentation. I will open it back up to Amy.
Great, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Appreciate it, that's for sure. Now, we had an archaeological dig at the Stroud Mansion in 2019.
Mm-hmm.
School was there, and what a wonderfully fascinating experience it was to watch the students. We had, I think it was about 10 to 12 students there.
It's great.
Techniques and the methodology of it. And it absolutely is a science. So more than I had even realized. You know, when they would dig the pit, this is what fascinated me the most. Well, I mean, everything fascinated me, but start to dig the pit, they had a bucket color that was associated with that pit. And then another pit on the other side of the yard would have a different colored bucket. And everything that came out of that pit was associated with that colored bucket. You know, and then that colored bucket would go to the sifters, and everything was cataloged, and just so much the methodology and the documentation. It was very, very intense.
Yes.
Every little thing gets a number, gets documented. We had big pieces. We had animal bones to sewing needles. I couldn't believe when students found a whole bunch of sewing needles.
Wow.
It was really, really fascinating. So I certainly appreciate the work that archaeologists do.
Yep, it's time consuming.
Yes, it is, but it's worth it. It's so exciting. A couple of questions.
Sure.
Modern archaeologists, when did the transition occur between kind of the older practices and the more modern ones? Certainly we don't use dynamite anymore to test sites.
So there are many transitions. Archaeology is a moving science. I like to say is a moving science because you have this British occupancy where archaeology is really created, and then you move into the early 1900s where things change a little bit more, and then we go more into scientific archaeology. Then we go into more of the study of archaeology rather than doing science. So when I went back for my master's degree, we weren't doing as much archaeology. We were doing more of the academic archaeology. So it changes, and it's finally slowly starting to go back into that scientific archaeology where people are actually going back out into the field and saying, let's look at the site based on what we have, rather than, no, let's take our documents and look at documents and see what we have in the ground, and that should be telling us what we have in the ground. So it changes I want to say every 30 to 40 years, it changes different ways. So we're back more on the older ways of doing archaeology instead of the more modern ways of doing archaeology. So,
right. And I'm sure historical records play such an important role. As more information is discovered about something, historical archaeology really helps, fill those pages.
absolutely.
They're really hand in hand. I watched a program, National Geographic program on Pompeii, and they were doing some digging, and excavating in the 1960s. And this archaeologist, obviously there's the bodies of the people that had perished during the volcanic explosion.
Mm-hmm.
He had created this narrative about the people that perished. This one was the merchant and this one was the servant. And they're, of course, doing x-rays now, and that's not even the case at all. This archaeologist had just created these stories to build excitement around it. And I'm thinking, this is 1960s, and you're just completely making up stories about these people that you have nothing to base it on. So it's like Howard Carter was doing better in the 1920s. I understand individuals are individuals, but I just thought that was kind of interesting that it just question what was going on there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Are there any general international agreements on archaeological standards?
There are a lot of them. That's another discussion that I could do, where we do have different preservation acts. We do have different agreements. UNESCO actually is probably the biggest supporter of that. And UNESCO, like I talked about before, is the preservation people of the world. They come in and do all of that stuff. So they are actually creating policies and agreements and such throughout. So there are actually tons of them. And just in America, I mean, we have preservation acts. We have NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Reparation Act. That one is a great example of it. But yes, there are ones that encompass the whole world.
Yeah, it would make sense that there's some kind of standards or some kind of agreement. I mean, obviously environments are different and all that kind of stuff, but best practices.
Yeah.
Here's the question: what do you think that we will learn about the pregnant mummy? That seems to, it's very interesting. Especially that it's a new find.
So some of the things that I would like to learn is about their pregnancy. Like, what did they do back then to help a pregnant woman? Or, were they taking their vitamins, or were they, having regular checks, or, so I'm kind of hoping that the science is actually going to show us a little bit more about that. And then how, what was the other thing I wanted to say? I'm just also hoping that they're going to see that, the hieroglyphics are also important, and how can we also look more at hieroglyphics to understand who we are looking at, rather than just assuming that this is a priest and this is this, and this was actually a woman. It was not a priest, and they thought for so many years that it was. And I think it's just going to help.
Are priests male? Are they always male? Maybe
yes.
Female. Maybe this is, who knows? So
yeah, so that's also something too. I mean, we may actually see that there's this switch over from everything being strictly male to maybe there was a woman that was in there, or so there's a lot of different things that we can learn from the pregnant mummy. So
and I know King Tut, in his tomb there were 2 mummified fetuses found, and they're obviously in very, very poor condition now, so they believe that they were stillborn. So clearly they were born and mummified, whereas this case, it would appear, of course I have no knowledge about this, but since it's still, in the mother, that she died, maybe in utero, sort of thing. So
they're hoping to see if they can figure out what caused it, because like I said, I mean, when they embalm somebody, everything comes out. So did they not know that she was pregnant? Did they know she was pregnant? I mean,
I'm sure they knew.
Oh, I'm sure that they knew.
They seem to know a lot about the inner organs and everything.
Yeah.
Is there an Egyptian mystery or find that particularly haunts you?
that really haunts me. Let's see.
Like you just want to know.
Cleopatra. I want to know where she is.
Oh, so you don't know where she is.
No, they have never found Cleopatra's mummy. They don't even know if she was embalmed. So there are a lot of questions behind that because her death was so mysterious, and she was bit by the snake. Did they have time to pull her body away before, you know, Caesar came in or Mark Antony came in and took her body? Or, you know, there's also rumors too that where she was, that is all underwater right now. So, you know, will we ever find her? I wish we would. I really do wish we would, because she's one of my favorites. So.
Now, did Great Britain have any other archaeological digs in any of their other colonies? Not just,
oh yeah.
Did they? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they pretty much did everywhere, I think. It's just you hear so much more about it in ancient Egypt because of the fun and the mysterious aspects of it. So,
well, I think everybody loves ancient Egypt. I mean, kids love it, adults love it, and I know at the Carnegie Science Center, you recently had a special traveling exhibition. I think was it just mummies?
Mummies of the world. Yeah.
Of the world. Okay. So can you share? I'm sure it was very well received by the public. Of course, this was pre-pandemic.
Yes, it was pre-pandemic. And actually when we shut down, we still had them. So we only just got rid of them in January or February. It was real recent. Mm-hmm. So we had them for a lot longer than we were expecting to. And the fun thing about mummies is that it's for everybody. I mean, there's not something that you can't learn about mummies. Mm-hmm. And one of the great things about mummies is that it wasn't just ancient Egyptian. It was everything. Like we had shrunken heads, we had bundle mummies, which is the first actually mummies that were ever created. They were actually created 9,000 years prior to the ancient Egyptians.
And is that in Chile? Is that where they?
Yes. So, and then we had ice mummies, we had all of them. So it was really fantastic for people to actually see that there are other mummies than just ancient Egyptian ones. Mm-hmm. But yes, it was received really well. There's actually a really high population of people who are interested in death and death culture in Pittsburgh. So we had a lot of it come through, and we did really well with mummies. Right. So it was fun.
As a traveling exhibit, do you think it's going to be, will it be moving on now that things seem to be opening up with the pandemic?
Yeah, it did move on. I think it went down to, I want to say it went down to Kansas City or something like that. So they were actually changing a couple of the mummies out, which I was kind of sad to not be able to know which ones they were. Right. But it was a great experience, and it was fun to be able to train and teach everybody about them.
That's great. What inspired you to follow this career path?
So I've always loved ancient Egypt. Even from a young child, my grandfather was
kids, everybody loves Egypt.
Yep. My grandfather was really into ancient Egypt, and he taught me a lot of what I know. I still actually have his collection, and I just fell in love with it. And there's something about finding something that nobody has touched for hundreds or thousands of years that just brings a thrill to me.
Right. And it's a connection. It's so long ago, but it's relatable. We're all people, and we're all a culture, and all have religion and all of that. So I can appreciate it. I also think it's interesting with mummies. They preserve the bodies that they would be going into the next life, and they would be remembered. These statues and these monuments, and they are remembered because we're still talking about them. And where is their tomb, and where are they? So they really have succeeded where
exactly
have failed, because everybody knows King Tut.
Yeah.
But when he passed away, that 2,000, 3,000 years later, the whole world would know his name or see the golden death mask and know exactly who that is.
Absolutely. It's just an amazing,
like one of the best success stories ever. And
that's the truth.
Mortality, right?
That is true. Very true.
Yeah. Good. I think that seems like that's all the questions we have. Thank you again so much for sharing your knowledge and spending the evening with us. We greatly appreciate your volunteering.
Absolutely. Anytime.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for tuning in. Have a great night.